Hello from the Channel studio in London and welcome to another edition of Foreign Dispatches, the programme that takes you around the world in 25 minutes. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. On the programme this week, allies pledge more weapons for Ukraine as it prepares for new counteroffensive against Russian forces. Plus, on the war front, residents evacuated from Russian-controlled city of Berdyansk in anticipation of Ukrainian military operation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky won fresh pledges for new long-range drones when he met with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak this week. It followed talks with other allies in France, Germany and Italy. Ukraine has been asking for long-range missiles, but support provided by Britain and other allies, such as the United States, has previously been limited to shorter-range weapons. The latest promise of weapons comes as Ukraine prepares for a much-anticipated counteroffensive against Russian forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited Britain as part of a tour of several key European allies aimed at securing new weapons. On top of the Storm Shadow cruise missiles announced last week, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced the UK will send hundreds of air defence missiles and armed drones to Ukraine. The promise of weapons adds to a haul of Western arms for a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia.
When Volodymyr was last here some months ago, I talked then about the provision of long-range weapons because of the capability that they would offer. I'm pleased we're the first country to be able to do that, and I'm pleased that they will make a difference to the defence of Ukraine, and we will keep providing support, as you've seen today, with long-range offensive drones, for example, more anti-aircraft, and there will be further support to come, and that's what we've been talking about today. But I think it's important for the Kremlin to also know that we're not going away. Right, we are here for the long term. We remain steadfast in wanting to defend Ukraine, not just now to reclaim its rightful territory, but also to ensure that Ukraine has the means to defend itself into the future as well.
Prime Minister Sunak also announced the UK would begin basic training of Ukrainian pilots this summer.
One thing we will be doing, starting actually relatively soon, is training of Ukrainian pilots, and that's something that we've discussed today. We're ready to implement those plans in relatively short order, which will mean that we're training Ukrainian citizens to become absolutely combat-ready aircraft pilots, and particularly whether it comes to NATO tactics as well, because that's an important part of the long-term relationship between our countries. So we've had very good productive discussions on that today. Other countries are involved. I'm talking to those leaders. I'll be doing more of that this week in my international engagement, and we're very keen to build that coalition of countries to give Volodymyr and his people the aircraft support that they need.
After the United States, Britain has been one of the largest suppliers of military aid to Ukraine, contributing £2.3 billion worth of support last year and pledging a similar amount for 2023. Britain, on May the 11th, became the first country to start supplying Ukraine cruise missiles, which will allow its forces to hit Russian troops and supply dumps deep behind the front lines.
I can confirm that the UK is donating Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Storm Shadow is a long-range, conventional-only precision strike capability. It complements the long-range systems already gifted, including HIMARS and Harpoon missiles, as well as Ukraine's own Neptune cruise missile and longer-range missions elsewhere gifted. The donation of these weapon systems gives Ukraine the best chance to defend themselves against Russia's continued brutality. Ukraine has a right to be able to defend itself against this. The use of Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to push back Russian forces based within Ukrainian sovereign territory. I'm sure the House will understand that I'm not going into further details of the capabilities, but while these weapons will give Ukraine new capability, members should recognise that these systems are not even in the same league as the Russian AS-24 Killjoy hypersonic missile or Shahed Iranian one-way attack drones, or even the Caliber cruise missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometres. roughly 7 times that of a Storm Shadow missile. Russia must recognise that their actions alone have led to such systems being provided to Ukraine. It is my judgment as the Defence Secretary that this is a calibrated and proportionate response to Russia's escalations.
Russia has said it does not believe the added British hardware would change the course of the conflict. President Zelensky's trip to Britain was the latest stop on a tour that saw him visit Rome, Berlin and Paris, pocketing major weapons pledges along the way. The EU Foreign Policy Chief has also said the bloc must speed up the supply of ammunition to Ukraine.
Certainly, we have to speed up the support. And give me a figure, just a figure. In the Bakhmut area, where fighting continues, Ukraine needs about 1,000 shots of artillery per day. 1,000 per day just in Bakhmut, in order to have an idea of the intensity of the fighting and the firepower of the Russia and how the Ukrainians can resist this continuous and systematic bombing.
Since last week, the Ukrainian military has started to push Russian forces back in and around the small eastern city of Bakhmut, its first significant offensive operations since its troops recaptured Kherson in the south in November. The battle for Bakhmut has become the longest and bloodiest of the war and has symbolic significance for Russia. Over the past year and a half, Kyiv has held its troops on the defensive, while Moscow mounted its campaign, sending hundreds of thousands of fresh reservists and mercenaries into Europe's bloodiest ground combat since World War II. Kyiv is now preparing for a counteroffensive, using hundreds of new tanks and armoured vehicles sent by Western countries since the start of the year. Their aim is to recapture the sixth of Ukraine's territory that Moscow claims to have annexed. Meanwhile, a temporary accommodation center has been set up in the Russian-controlled Ukrainian city of Berdyansk ahead of the long-expected counteroffensive. The Ukrainian military has accused Moscow of forcibly evacuating people from the area, something it denies. This is a temporary accommodation center in Berdyansk in Russian-controlled Ukraine. Ahead of a long-expected Ukrainian counteroffensive, families were brought here by Russian-installed authorities in the southern Zaporizhzhia region. A volunteer from the Russian Movement for Children and Youth said about 2,000 people have arrived so far. The Russian-installed acting governor of the region, which Moscow has claimed as its own, says the increased Ukrainian shelling of 18 settlements near the front line led to what he calls the temporary relocation of people. Ukraine's military has accused Moscow of forcibly evacuating people from the area, something it denies. Berdyansk has been under Russian control since February the 27th of last year, just 3 days after Moscow launched what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Some evacuees say they chose to be evacuated themselves for security reasons.
I decided to leave to keep my family safe from all the events that are taking place near the front line. We're sure that everything will be fine, but we don't want to take any risk. When the opportunity arose, we left.
We've had shells landing nearby, and when it landed, the entire sky was red. People get used to it fast. Children get used to it. They stop being afraid. When they announced the evacuation, we decided not to ignore it, because who knows what might happen. It's not just for nothing, so we decided to leave.
While the evacuees express satisfaction with their new conditions, they hope for an end to the war and to one day return home. Well, Latvia is the EU country with the largest Russian minority, with ethnic Russians making up approximately 25% of its population. For them, the war in Ukraine has been a political and social crisis. A small country on the Baltic Sea with just over 1.8 million people, Latvia has recently passed a series of controversial laws in a bid to reduce Russia's influence in the former Soviet nation. Speaking Russian in Latvia has not been a problem until now. About a fourth of the country's population is ethnically Russian, and it was generally acceptable to have Russian as a person's only language. But the war in Ukraine has entirely changed the picture. When Moscow began its invasion of Ukraine, Latvia switched off Russian TV channels and crushed a Soviet World War II monument. It also started working towards eliminating education in Russian. And now in the capital, dozens of elderly Russian citizens wait to take a basic Latvian language test as a proof of loyalty to a country where they have lived for decades. Each applied for Russian passports after independent Latvia re-emerged in 1991 from the ashes of the Soviet Union. It made them eligible for retirement at 55, a pension from Russia, and visa-free travel to Russia and Belarus. They fear they may be deported if they fail the test.
Despite concerns, I have faith that Latvia is a democratic state and will not resort to mass deportations. I have no other place to go, as I have resided here for 40 years. Although I was born in Belarus, I obtained Russian citizenship only to visit my ailing parents who needed my care at the time.
Last year saw a growing rift between the country's Latvian majority and its Russian-speaking minority over their place in society. There was widespread anger over former Soviet master Moscow's invasion in Ukraine. And after the country's 2022 election campaign, which was dominated by questions of national identity, the government has demanded 20,000 people sit through language exams.
If we make the difference between emotions and legal regulation, we understand. If you are citizen of another state, you are under protection, also under social protection and other kind of protection of another state. If you want to be and want to reside in other state, you have to be in compliance with immigration law.
Russian citizens under 75 who do not pass the test by the end of the year will be given reasonable time to leave. If not, they could face forced expulsion. Latvia, a member of NATO and the EU, has pushed for a strong global response to Russia's war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the three Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, are accelerating work to sever their remaining energy ties to Russia, following Kremlin threats to shut down links between the three countries and its electricity grid.
Given the current geopolitical context, accelerated desynchronization, in other words, moving away from dependence from Russia and Belarus in terms of electricity grids, is key for our security and energy independence. We have direct experience, unfortunately, of how Russia weaponizes energy. Also, this winter, we witnessed Russia's systematic attempts to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure, so we cannot ignore even the slightest possibility that Russia could also exploit our dependence on its electricity networks at the most critical moment.
I'm convinced that when we look as the Baltic countries at our long-term energy objective, this is to go fully renewable, that is to be completely independent of fossil fuels, thereby making sure that in the future we would never again be dependent on single-source providers, be it Russia or someone else.
Bordering Russia, the Baltic states have sharply boosted defense spending in response to Russia's 2014 capture of Crimea from Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine last year. When Foreign Dispatches returns, over a month since violence erupted in Khartoum, families who fled conflict remain stranded in Port Sudan. More details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us on Foreign Dispatches. A month after Sudan's conflict erupted, hundreds of people are stuck in Port Sudan, battling extreme heat and dwindling supplies of food and water. The conflict between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has caused a humanitarian crisis that threatens to destabilize the region, displacing more than 700,000 people inside Sudan and forcing about 200,000 people to flee into neighboring countries.
It's been over a month since Sudan's sudden eruption into violence. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced by bombings and gunfire, mainly from the capital, Khartoum. But for many still stranded in the coastal city Port Sudan, they are now facing extreme heat and a lack of water and shelter.
We came from war, and we're staying here, in this heat. This is not healthy for these children. We're unable to do anything, and no one is helping. Humanitarian organizations, please help us. Not for us, but for the sake of these children. We have pregnant and sick elderly women. We have people whose health could get worse in this situation.
Stranded families have been sleeping inside tents they've built from blankets or huddling in shaded areas as they try to escape the intense sunlight.
The problem we are getting here is a very big problem. That now we are being, the people, they don't like us to be here. And now the way we are here with the children and the mothers, some of them are sick, and there's no food, people they can eat. So we are suffering. We came under the United Nations, but they cannot do anything to us. We came to the government of Sudan, who are leading this town over here. They cannot help us anymore.
More than 700,000 people have been displaced in Sudan, and over 200,000 have fled to neighboring countries since violence erupted last month.
Violence in Sudan continued for a fourth week. Around 200,000 refugees and returnees have been forced to flee the country, with more crossing borders daily seeking safety. Additionally, hundreds of thousands have been internally displaced, with many more people confined to their homes and unable to access necessities. The humanitarian response to this emergency is challenging and costly, not only inside Sudan because of insecurity, but also as refugees and returnees are arriving in remote border areas in neighboring countries where services and infrastructure are scarce or non-existent.
The United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan is seeking $2.5 billion to help people affected by the crisis.
We aim to reach 18 million people. The funding requirements of nearly $2.6 billion is also the highest for any humanitarian appeal for Sudan. The conflict that erupted on the 15th of April last month in Sudan has killed hundreds of people, injured more than 5,000 people, and millions more have been confined to their homes, unable to access basic services and essential health care. And nearly 1 million people have been displaced, many across to neighboring countries. Today, 25 million people, more than half the population of Sudan, need humanitarian aid and protection. This is the highest number we have ever seen in the country. The response plan we are launching today reflects that new reality.
We're already doing everything that we can, as fast as we can, but sadly, we need, once again, to call on countries and individuals with the means to step up for innocent people who have lost everything through no fault of their own. Today, we launch an appeal for some $472 million to respond to the needs of over 1 million persons over the next 6 months.
Meanwhile, the violence continues back in Khartoum. Intense clashes have continued in the capital and its sister cities, Bari and Omdurman, despite Saudi and US brokered talks between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. On Monday, the Sudanese army was carrying out airstrikes in Khartoum's northern region, targeting paramilitary forces around a hospital. Most hospitals in the capital have already been put out of service. The bloodshed has killed at least 670 people and injured over 5,570, according to official figures, though the real toll is expected to be much higher.
Finally on the program, with 38 coastal states and 6 island nations, Africa sits on immense ocean economic potential. The African Union estimates that the continent's blue economy currently generates nearly $300 billion, creating 49 million jobs. Experts, however, say these figures could be so much more if only challenges holding back the continent are tackled. Our South Africa Bureau Chief, Betty Dibia, now reports.
According to the organizers, the symposium's goal was to explore various aspects of Africa's blue or ocean economy and the roles the navies of the continent can play, with other entities, of course, in ensuring security for starters. Ahead of a very interactive session, Nigeria's Chief of the Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Awal Gambo, gave the main presentation from a Nigerian perspective. He appealed for deeper collaboration between African states and agencies, with much more emphasis on research and development as well as resource deployment for such.
All we need to do is collectively, united, indivisibly, synergize. Permit me to share a quotation by Sir Walter Raleigh. I always refer to him. Whoever commands the sea commands the trade. Whoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world.
There were many words on marble during the interactive session, highlighting the importance of the knowledge of the continent's ocean resources, patrolling governed and ungoverned spaces, and information sharing post-research, the role of national interests in combating crime, the issue of interagency rivalry, among other challenges.
If we have the common understanding of what maritime security is within the context of the blue economy, as to warrant us to have marine special planning administrators to govern that space solely for the purpose of economic and sustainable development, then we will be able to achieve much better.
We must make our R&D to also believe that there are resources that can promote the blue economy within the internal waterways and maritime environment, not just the ocean ways, because we've so far been talking more on the waterways.
Another aspect that hasn't been really mentioned so far is the environmental challenges. With all maritime crime and with the interdiction and the enforcement, you have the threat of damage to the environment.
Then we need that R&D, we need technology. We are where we are today because of technology R&D. And the maritime environment, we have ignored so much. I'm standing here addressing you in English. Why? Because we did not import it with the sea. We were colonized by the sea. Today we lost identity, we speak English. Okay? So we have to protect it.
Day 2 saw the participants breaking into 3 syndicates to discuss maritime trade and global linkages, enhancing cooperation and harmonizing African solutions at sea, as well as the role of technology. The question we asked was, after the discussions and communique, what next?
Political will. It takes political will to operationalize all the communique.
The presentation will be made to the African Union, of course, because that is the continental regional body. And of course, there are the different regional bodies, which is the SADC and the West Africa. And these people will also get this across to them, so that from the heads of government level, the political will can be put into the discussions that are being held.
The prospects and opportunities for Africa's blue economy are many. So are the challenges. Well, the hope of the participants at this symposium is that what will be coming out will provide enough food for thought and actions for African leaders as they steer the continents towards attaining the much talked about Agenda 2063.
And that's the program today, but remember, our top stories are never far away. You can catch them on channelstv.com. Thank you for watching. I'm Teniola Oyetayo. Bye for now.